The wind that came off the Detroit River in mid-December didn't behave like ordinary cold. It didn't simply lower the temperature. It pursued you. It found the gap between your collar and your jaw, the inch of exposed wrist between your glove and your sleeve, the thin place in a worn-out coat where the insulation had long since compressed into nothing. It found every weakness, and it pushed through methodical and merciless, as though the cold had a personal grievance against anyone still foolish enough to be outside after dark. Nora Callahan was not outside, but she might as well have been. She sat in the back seat of a 1998 Ford Taurus, the color of old rust and older regret, parked deep in the shadow of the massive concrete pillars that held up the I-94 overpass. The car hadn't moved under its own power in 11 days. The heater had stopped working 2 days after that. What remained was a shell of metal and glass that did just enough to block the wind, but nothing at all about the temperature, which had dropped to 9 degrees below zero sometime around midnight and showed no intention of climbing back. Beside Nora, pressed against her left side and wrapped in every blanket they owned, three of them all thin, all bought from a Salvation Army bin for $1 apiece, was her daughter May. 6 years old. Dark hair, dark eyes, small even for her age. She was asleep or close to it, her breath coming in slow, visible clouds that rose and dissolved in the frozen air of the car's interior. Nora watched each breath. She had been watching them for hours. On the floorboard between the front seats, a single can of sterno fuel burned with a low blue flame, barely visible, producing more symbol than heat. Balanced above it on a makeshift cradle of bent wire hanger was a dented tin pot. Inside the pot, a can of generic chicken noodle soup was slowly warming. Store brand. The label had a small dent in it from where it had rolled off a shelf at the food pantry 3 days ago. Nora had caught it before it hit the ground. That was the last time she had been inside a warm building. She watched the flame. She watched the pot. She watched May's chest rise and fall. These were the three things she allowed herself to focus on, because focusing on anything else on the balance of her checking account, which read $11.40, on the fact that the nearest food pantry didn't open again until Monday, on the question of what they would eat tomorrow and the day after, produced a sensation in her chest that she had learned to recognize as the outer edge of panic. And panic was a luxury she could not afford. Nora Callahan was 32 years old. She had a degree in early childhood education from Wayne State that she had never finished using. She had a laugh that people described as contagious when she still laughed. She had once grown tomatoes in raised beds along the south side of a small house in Ferndale, and she had been proud of those tomatoes in a way that seemed almost embarrassing now in retrospect, given everything that came after. She had also had a husband. Danny Callahan had been a carpenter. Not a contractor, not a business owner, just a man who showed up to job sites at 6 in the morning and came home at 5 in the afternoon smelling of sawdust and cheap coffee, and whatever wood he'd been working with that day pine on Mondays, usually oak toward the end of the week when the finish work began. He was not a large man. He was not a dramatic man. He told the same 4 jokes in rotation and knew it and didn't care. He made pancakes on Saturday mornings and always burned the first one, and always acted surprised about it, and May had thought this was the funniest thing in the world. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday in June, 18 months before the night Nora sat watching a sterno flame in a car under an overpass. Stage 3 lung cancer, non-smoker. The kind of diagnosis that arrives without explanation or logic, that simply lands in your life the way a tree falls across a road, not because you did anything wrong, not because the universe was making a point, but simply because trees fall and roads exist, and sometimes they intersect. They fought it. That was the word everyone used. They fought it. They tried the standard treatments first, and when those produced diminishing returns, they moved to experimental protocols available only at a specialty clinic in Ann Arbor, which was not covered by their insurance, which meant loans. Personal loans first, then a second mortgage, then the kind of lending that comes with terms you don't fully read because you are too tired and too frightened, and the man you love is losing weight at a rate that no longer makes sense. Danny worked as long as he could, then he couldn't. Nora picked up substitute teaching hours, then waitressing shifts, then both simultaneously for a period of about 4 months that she remembered now only as a blur of alarm clocks and black coffee and the exhaustion of running as hard as you can while knowing the ground beneath you is still sinking. Danny died on a Saturday in October. Not a pancake Saturday, just a Saturday gray and quiet with rain against the hospital window. The foreclosure notice arrived 6 weeks later. The bank was not cruel about it. They were simply procedural, which felt worse. By the first week of December, Nora and May were living in the Taurus, which Danny had paid off 3 years earlier, and which was therefore the one thing no one could take from them. That and the tin pot. The tin pot had been Danny's idea of camping equipment purchased at a hardware store closing sale for 75 cents. It had made approximately 4 camping trips, none of them particularly successful. After he died, Nora had found it in the garage and packed it with the car without quite knowing why. It had become over the past 3 weeks their most essential piece of equipment. They heated water in it for instant oatmeal. They heated soup. On one occasion, Nora had melted snow in it when the water bottles ran dry. The soup was almost ready. "Mommy?" May's voice came from somewhere inside the cocoon of blankets. Small, careful. The voice she used when she was trying not to complain. "I know, Bug." Nora reached over and tucked the edge of the top blanket more firmly under May's chin. 2 more minutes. "My toes hurt." "I know. The soup's going to warm up your tummy, and then we'll sleep close together, and I'll put my feet against yours. Okay?" A pause. Then with the trust that 6-year-olds place in their mothers as a matter of biological necessity. "Okay." Nora looked at the flame. She looked at the pot. She thought about tomorrow and then stopped thinking about tomorrow and looked at the flame again. The sound that came next was not gradual. It didn't build from a distance. It arrived all at once, tearing through the rhythmic howl of the wind with a violence that made the whole car shudder, a shrieking grind of metal against frozen asphalt, sharp and sustained, followed by an impact that Nora felt in her back teeth. Then silence. Then from somewhere beyond the concrete pillars, a sound that was much worse than the crash. A low groan, wet, effortful. The sound a person makes when they are trying to determine whether they are still alive. May's eyes flew open. "Don't move," Nora said. Her voice had shifted without her deciding to shift it, dropping into the register she used for situations that required May to listen without asking questions. "Stay in the blankets. Do not get out of the car." She reached to the floorboard and picked up the tire iron she kept there. Not because she had any particular plan for it, but because it was heavy and solid, and it was the only thing she owned that could function in a desperate moment as a statement of intent. She pushed the door open. The cold hit her like a physical thing, like walking into a wall that had been refrigerated. Her eyes watered immediately. Her nose, her lips, the exposed skin of her face, everything tightened and stung in the first 2 seconds. She squinted through the wind-driven snow, scanning the darkness beyond the pillars, toward the access road that ran parallel to the overpass. She saw the motorcycle first. A massive custom Harley-Davidson, its chrome catching what little ambient light existed now lying on its side, with its front wheel bent at an angle that no front wheel was designed to achieve. It had gone into the guardrail with enough force to fold the metal. There was a dark stain spreading in the snow beneath it that Nora hoped was oil. A few feet from the bike, half submerged in the snowbank at the edge of the road, was a man. He was enormous. Even lying down, even partially buried, she could see that. 6'4", maybe more. Built like someone who had spent decades doing physical work that didn't involve a gym. He was wearing heavy denim jeans, thick-soled boots, and a leather vest over a flannel shirt that was not remotely sufficient for 9 degrees below zero. The vest, what bikers called a cut, was torn at the shoulder, and beneath the tear dark blood had already begun to freeze against the fabric. Nora stopped 6 feet away and stood very still. She could see the back of the vest clearly in the pale light. The top rocker read the club's name. The center patch was the winged death's head rendered in white and red that anyone who had grown up in Michigan would recognize without being told what it meant. The bottom rocker read Michigan. She knew what that patch meant. She had grown up hearing the name. She had seen the news stories. She understood at a basic and practical level that the man lying in the snow in front of her was someone that most reasonable people in most reasonable circumstances would not approach. She also understood that he was dying. The violent shivering had already begun, the full-body convulsions that look from the outside almost like a seizure, and that represent the body's last serious attempt to generate heat through movement before it abandons the effort entirely. His thick beard was already caking with frost. His lips, she could see even from 6 feet away, had turned the color of a bruise. He opened his eyes. They were pale blue, bloodshot at the edges, wide with a recognition that was not quite fear, more the clear-eyed, unwilling awareness of a man who has survived a great many dangerous situations and knows with certainty that this is the one that's going to take him. He looked at her. He tried to speak. His jaw was locked, the muscles seized by cold, and what came out was not a word but the shape of one, an effortful movement of a mouth that could no longer complete the circuit from intention to sound. Nora looked at the tire iron in her hand. She looked at the man. She set the tire iron down in the snow. "You have to help me," she said, raising her voice against the wind. "I can't carry you. You have to push with your legs. Do you understand me?" Something in his eyes shifted. Not gratitude, it was too early and too cold for gratitude. More like recalibration. Like a machine that had already begun its shutdown sequence, receiving an unexpected input and pausing briefly to assess. He moved his right hand, dug it into the snow. His left arm, she realized, was not responding properly. There was something wrong with the shoulder, a wrongness visible even through the leather. "Left arms hurt," she said, not a question. "Use your right and your legs. When I pull, you push. Ready." She grabbed the lapels of his cut with both hands. The leather was stiff with cold. She braced her feet and pulled. He pushed. It took 4 attempts. On the first, he barely moved. On the second, they got him 6 inches. On the third, his right boot found purchase on a patch of frozen asphalt, and he lunged forward enough that Nora almost fell backward. On the fourth, with her arms burning and her breath coming in ragged white clouds, they crossed the threshold from the open road into the sheltered space beneath the overpass. She got him to the concrete pillar nearest her car and propped him against it. He sat with his head back against the concrete, eyes open, chest heaving, shaking so hard she could hear his teeth when they connected. She knew enough first aid to know that when the shivering stopped, the situation became critical. The shivering was his body fighting. She needed to help his body win at least long enough for whoever needed to come. She turned to the car. May was watching through the frost-webbed glass, her eyes enormous and very still. "May," Nora said her daughter's name in the tone that carried a request inside it rather than a command. "I need the soup." A pause. She watched May look at the pot, watched her look at her mother. Then without a word, without a single syllable of protest, the 6-year-old carefully reached forward, lifted the tin pot by its makeshift wire handle, and pushed open the car door just far enough to extend her arm into the cold. Nora took the pot. She grabbed the single plastic spoon they owned from the cup holder, walked back to the man propped against the pillar, and crouched down beside him in the dirt and frozen grime of the overpass floor. "Open your eyes," she said. "Look at me." His eyes opened, found her face. "Eat this." She raised the spoon to his lips. "It's hot, don't rush it." His lips parted. The broth went in. She watched his throat move as he swallowed, watched some of the rigid frozen quality in his face shift, not dramatically, not immediately, but the way a fist unclenches when the pressure that caused it finally relents. She gave him another spoonful, and another. After the fourth, he raised his right hand slowly and closed it around the rim of the pot. "I got it," he said. His voice sounded like gravel dragged across concrete, but it was a voice. He was using it. That was something. She let him take the pot. He drank, not with a spoon, but straight from the rim, tilting it back, taking in the broth in long measured swallows, then the noodles, then the small pale cubes of processed chicken until the pot was empty and he lowered it and held it in his lap and breathed. The shivering was beginning to slow. Not gone, not even close to gone, but the quality of it had changed from the violent, uncontrolled convulsions of the body in crisis to the deeper, slower trembling of a body beginning to remember that it knew how to regulate itself. He sat with the empty pot in his hands for a long moment. Then he looked past Nora at the car. At May, who was still watching from the back seat, the blankets pulled up to her chin, her eyes tracking the empty tin pot with the focused attention of a child who was very hungry and has learned not to say so too often. Rex Malone was not by any reasonable measure a sentimental man. He had lived 48 years in a way that required the deliberate removal of certain kinds of feeling from the decision-making process. He had made choices in his life that required not thinking too hard about consequences. He had built a version of himself that was useful, durable, and largely impervious to the ordinary pressures that bent other men. But he was not stupid. He looked at the empty pot. He looked at the child in the car. He looked at the dead sterno can on the floorboard, and the 3 thin blankets, and the rusted door panels, and the complete unambiguous poverty of everything around him. And he understood with absolute clarity what had just happened. "That was your food," he said, his voice still rough, still stripped by cold, but fully functional, now fully present. "That was all you had." The woman, he didn't know her name yet, looked away. She took the empty pot from his hands without looking at him. "You were dying," she said. "You needed the heat more than we did." He studied her profile, the pale, gaunt face, the cracked lips, the coat that was one hard winter from being a rag, the way she held herself straight, deliberate, not performing strength, but actually possessing it, the kind that comes not from an absence of fear, but from an extended practice of ignoring it. "Do you know who I am?" he asked. She looked at him then, directly. "I know what your jacket says," she replied. There was a slight tremor in her voice that she was working to control. "It doesn't matter. I couldn't let a man freeze to death in front of my daughter." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a smartphone with a cracked screen. He dialed. It rang once. "It's Rex," he said. "I went down on the I-94 access road. Black ice. Left collarbone probably broken. Bring the van. And Cutter." He paused. "Yeah. Now." He ended the call and put the phone away. He looked at the woman again. At the child in the car. Something moved behind his eyes, not warmth exactly, not the softened expression of a man having a sentimental moment, but something more serious than that. Something that looked in the half-dark under the overpass like a decision being made. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated. "Then Nora. That's May." He gave a single slow nod. He didn't offer his name in return. In his world, names were offered on a different timeline than gratitude, and gratitude itself was offered differently than most people expected. He said nothing more. Neither did she. They sat in the cold together, the big man against the pillar, and the thin woman crouched beside him while the wind continued its assault on the open road, and the sterno flame in the car guttered and finally went out. The van arrived 11 minutes later. Matte black, no markings tires that could handle winter roads. It came off the highway exit without slowing and rolled under the overpass with the confidence of a vehicle whose driver had been in worse situations than this. 2 men got out, both in leather cuts, both large. They moved to Rex with the practiced efficiency of people who had handled injured men before assessing quickly, supporting without crowding, getting him upright, and moving toward the van without drama. One of them, Cutter Briggs, built like a highway bridge tattooed to the jaw, broke off briefly to assess the wreckage of the motorcycle with the pained expression of a man appraising a serious loss. Rex walked under his own power, which said something about him. Not without difficulty, not without a visible tension in his jaw that indicated the broken collarbone was making itself known with every step, but under his own power. At the van's passenger door, he stopped. He turned and looked back at Nora, who stood beside her car with the empty tin pot still in her hands and the expression of a woman who is maintaining composure through sheer force of will. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes steady now, not the panicked dimming of a man losing his fight with the cold, but the clear eyes of a man who had returned from the edge of something and was taking the measure of what he found on this side. Then he got in the van. The door closed. The engine turned over deep and quiet. The van backed out from under the overpass, turned onto the access road, and disappeared into the dark and the snow, its taillights fading to nothing in seconds. Nora stood in the cold and listened to the silence that came after. It was a silence that follows the departure of something large, something that had temporarily organized the air around it and now left that air with nothing to do. The wind came back in to fill it, same as before, indifferent as ever. She looked down at the tin pot in her hands. She had given it away. That was the simple, unavoidable fact. She had given away the one thing she had that was warm, the one thing standing between May and a night spent hungry in 9-degree cold. And she had given it to a man in a biker's cut who had taken it without a word of thanks and driven away into the dark. She climbed back into the car and pulled the door shut. May was crying. Not loudly. May had learned in 3 weeks of living in the car not to cry loudly, which was its own kind of heartbreak. Just the quiet, steady tears of a child who is hungry and tired and cold and trusts her mother enough to feel all of those things without hiding them. "I'm sorry, Bug." Nora's voice broke in the middle of the sentence. She pulled May against her, wrapping both arms around the small body, pressing her own inadequate warmth against her daughter, as though she could transfer it by force of will. "I'm so sorry." "It's okay," May said. The automatic response of a child who has been told too many times by adults in distress that everything is fine. "It's okay, Mommy." It was not okay. Nora knew it was not okay. And the knowing sat in her chest like a stone cold and immovable as she pressed her face against the top of her daughter's head and breathed in the smell of her hair and thought about tomorrow with a clarity that was, at that hour and that temperature, the most terrifying thing she had ever experienced. Because tomorrow was Monday, which meant the food pantry opened. But the food pantry was 3.5 miles away, and the car wouldn't start. And walking 3.5 miles in this cold with a 6-year-old was not something she was certain both of them could do. And even if they made it, she had $11.40 and a tank that was an eighth full and a phone with 17% battery and no prospect of any of those numbers improving in any meaningful way. She held May. She stayed awake. She had been doing this, the staying awake, the watching, the vigilance since the night Danny died, when she had sat in the hospital chair beside his bed for 6 hours after he was gone, because leaving meant it was real, and she wasn't ready for it to be real. She had discovered something in that long night, and in the long nights that followed, that staying awake felt like the only form of agency left to her. Like if she watched carefully enough, paid attention with enough intensity, she could catch whatever came next before it landed. Outside, the wind doubled back on itself. The temperature dropped another 2 degrees. Under the 3 thin blankets, May finally stopped crying and fell into the shallow, restless sleep of the cold and hungry. Her small feet, even through her socks, were like stones against Nora's legs. The hours passed the way hours pass when you are waiting for something you don't know how to name, slowly, and then in chunks, and then slowly again. At some point past 2 in the morning, Nora became aware that she was praying. Not formally, not in any way she could have described to another person, but in the wordless way of someone who has exhausted every other option. Not bargaining, not requesting, just sending out the thinnest possible signal into the dark. The way you'd call out in a building you weren't sure anyone else was in, not expecting an answer, but unable to stop yourself from making the sound. She thought about Danny. She thought about the smell of that kitchen on Saturday mornings. Not the pancakes specifically, but what they meant, that someone had gotten up early to make something warm, and that this had been once an ordinary thing. She thought about the 4 jokes he told in rotation, and the way he'd never stopped telling them, as if the constancy of a bad joke was its own form of love. She thought about the way he would come home from a job site and go straight to the garden before coming inside, pulling a tomato off the vine and eating it, standing there in his work clothes as though the first order of business after a day of making things was to eat something that had grown without being built. She thought, I did not do anything wrong. She thought, that doesn't seem to matter. She thought I gave a dying man our last meal and he drove away without saying thank you, and I don't regret it, and I don't know what that means about me. The night pressed down. At 4:15 in the morning, a snowplow passed on the highway above its orange light, strobing through the gaps in the concrete and throwing brief, strange shadows across the interior of the car. May stirred. Nora tightened her arm. May settled. By 5, the sky had begun the long, reluctant process of lightening, not warming, not offering anything resembling comfort, but simply moving from the absolute black of deep winter night to the deep gray of deep winter dawn. The kind of light that reveals rather than illuminates, that shows you exactly where you are and offers no improvement in the showing. Nora sat in the growing gray light and looked at her daughter's sleeping face and thought about what she was going to do. She would get out of the car. She would bundle May in every blanket. She would begin walking toward warmth. There was a McDonald's 2 miles west that opened at 5 and would allow her to buy the cheapest item on the menu and sit inside in the heat for as long as they'd let her. That was the plan. That was as far as the plan went. She was reaching for the door handle, preparing herself for the cold when she felt it. Not heard it, felt it. A vibration that started somewhere beneath the car and moved upward through the floorboards and into the seat beneath her and up through her spine. Rhythmic, deep, synchronized in a way that natural sounds are not synchronized. A vibration with pattern, with intention, which she realized as it grew with the layered, overlapping rumble of many large engines running in concert. She stopped moving. May's eyes opened. The sound grew. It grew the way thunder grows when it's not moving away from you, but toward you, swelling from a distant suggestion into something that occupied the air, then the ground, then everything. Nora reached out and wiped the condensation from the side window with the back of her hand, clearing a rough oval of visibility through the frost. What she saw on the other side of the glass stopped her breath. Coming down the access road, not one or two, not a handful, but a column that stretched back around the curve of the road and beyond, back further than she could see, were motorcycles. Dozens of them, then more dozens behind those. Row after row of Harley-Davidsons moving in formation, their headlights cutting through the gray morning air in perfect parallel lines, their engines filling the space under the overpass with a sound that was no longer just sound, but atmosphere, a climate of its own. They came and they came and they kept coming. Nora sat completely still. May pressed her face against the glass beside her mother's. The motorcycles turned, precisely, deliberately. The lead bikes angled off the access road and into the parking area beneath the overpass, and the ones behind them followed, and the ones behind those, and they spread out and arranged themselves in a formation that was clearly not accidental, that had been planned, had been discussed at some point in the previous hours by people who knew exactly what they were doing and why. They surrounded the Taurus. Not aggressively, the bikes moved into position with the deliberate calm of people who understood that presence by itself was enough. But completely. The motorcycles took up every available position around the car, filling the space beneath the overpass with chrome and leather, and the winged death's head emblem repeated on fuel tanks and vest backs in every direction Nora looked. And then in a cascading wave that moved from the front of the formation backward, the engines began to shut down, one by one, then in pairs, then in clusters, until the sound died out in a long diminuendo, and what remained was the sharp percussive sound of 500 kickstands hitting frozen pavement in a ragged final chorus. The silence that followed was the loudest silence Nora Callahan had ever heard. The crowd parted. A narrow aisle opened through the mass of leather and chrome running directly from the edge of the formation to the driver's side door of the Taurus. At the far end of that aisle, walking toward her with a white plaster cast, immobilizing his left arm from wrist to shoulder, was the man she had fed soup to 6 hours ago. Rex Malone walked without hurrying. Beside him was a man she didn't recognize, older, with a gray beard worn in a long braid, in the bearing of someone who had spent a lifetime making decisions and living with them. Behind them both came Cutter Briggs, carrying a large insulated cooler with both arms as though it weighed nothing. Rex stopped at her window. In the gray morning light with his collarbone set and immobilized, and the frantic dimming of hypothermia gone from his eyes, he looked exactly like what he was, a large, scarred, weathered man in middle age who had survived something and returned because of it. Nora reached out and cranked the window down. The handle protested with a high-strained squeak. The cold poured in. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Told you I'd see you around," Rex said. His voice was still gravel, but the warmth had come back into it, the resonance that cold strips away and the living body restores. He nodded to the man beside him. "This is Garrett Cole," Rex said. "He runs the charter." Garrett Cole stepped forward. He took off his leather gloves, thick, lined the gloves of a man who had been on a motorcycle in December by choice, and rested his bare hands on the windowsill of the Taurus. His hands were large, calloused, and very still. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was resonant, deliberate, the voice of a man who chose his words because he meant them. "My name is Garrett. Rex is my vice president. He's also my brother in every way that matters." He paused. "He told me what happened last night. Everything." Nora said nothing. She was holding May against her side, one arm around her daughter, and her jaw was clenched against the cold and against something else, against the effort of holding herself together when composure was the last thing she still owned. "He told me you were sitting in the dark," Garrett continued, "in the freezing cold with a hungry little girl who hadn't eaten since the night before, and you gave him your last hot meal." "He wasn't hungry," Nora said. "He was dying." Garrett looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression, not surprise but recognition, the way a man looks when something confirms what he already suspected. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. He was. He stepped back and turned to look at the men behind him, at the hundreds of them still and waiting in the cold morning air, their breath rising in unison. "We take care of our own," Garrett said. "That's the first law. Everything else comes second." He turned back to Nora. "As of last night, Nora, you are our own." Beside her, May reached out and touched the window glass, pressing her small palm against the frost, with the grave curiosity of a child who is witnessing something large and doesn't yet have the words for it. Rex leaned in. And for the first time since she'd met him, since she'd crouched in the frozen dirt of the overpass floor and spooned soup into his locked jaw, Rex Malone produced something that was unmistakably, if briefly, a smile. "Grab the kid," he said. "You're not sleeping in a car ever again." Two female riders climbed out of the formation and came to the car without being asked. They moved with the quiet efficiency of people who had handled difficult situations and didn't need to announce it. One of them opened the back door and began gathering the blankets, folding them with a matter-of-factness that somehow made the gesture less like charity and more like logistics. The other crouched beside May and spoke to her in a low voice, asking her name, asking if she liked hot chocolate. The kind of small-talk questions that are not really small talk, but rather the deliberate work of making a frightened child feel seen. May answered both questions. Her name, and yes, she did like hot chocolate. Nora let them help. This was harder than it sounds. She had spent 14 months building the particular pride of a woman who has learned that accepting help means accepting the reality of how badly she needs it. The kind of pride that holds weight, that bears load that a woman develops when she has decided to need nothing from anyone. And that reality was one she had been managing very carefully in very small doses, because too much of it at once felt like it might take her apart at the seams. But she let them help. Cutter Briggs had set the insulated cooler on the hood of the Taurus and opened it, and the smell that came out of it hit the cold air like a physical force, butter and maple syrup, and grilled meat, and something sweet and dark that May identified before anyone else did. "That's hot chocolate," May said with the authority of a child delivering a verdict. "It is," Cutter confirmed. He was a man of approximately the same dimensions as a refrigerator, with hands that looked like they could palm a basketball and forearms covered in faded ink, and he said it with the seriousness the moment deserved. He pulled out the aluminum trays, peeled back the foil, thick cuts of grilled steak, Buttermilk pancakes stacked 4 high already buttered, the edges going translucent where the heat had worked into them. Scrambled eggs, hash browns crisp at the edges and soft in the middle. A second biker appeared from somewhere in the formation, carrying a massive thermos and 2 heavy ceramic mugs, the kind that hold heat because they're built for it, not because they're delicate. May received her plate with both hands and looked at it for a moment before she ate the way people sometimes do when they've been hungry long enough that the food itself seems briefly unreal. Then she ate. Nora took a plate. She stood at the window of the Taurus in the freezing air, surrounded by 500 members of one of the most notorious motorcycle clubs in the country, and she ate steak with a plastic fork and she cried. Not demonstratively, not in a way that announced itself and asked for attention. Just the quiet, involuntary leak of tears that happens when the body has been holding something at tremendous pressure for a very long time and is suddenly, without warning, given permission to release. Nobody mentioned it. In this particular company, on this particular morning, that was its own form of grace. Rex stood at the window and didn't rush them. He stood the way men stand when they are performing the function of being a wall between the people they've decided to protect and whatever might be on the other side. The army of bikers remained where they were, still and patient in the cold, their breath rising in synchronized clouds above the chrome and leather. When Nora had eaten enough to bring the color back into her face, Garrett Cole stepped forward again. He rested his forearms on the windowsill and looked at her with the direct, unhurried attention of a man who has something to say and intends to say it once. "I want to tell you something," he said, "and I want you to hear it, not just listen to it." Nora wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist, nodded. "In our world," Garrett said, "loyalty is not a courtesy. It's not something you offer when it's convenient or when you stand to gain from it. It's the thing you do when it costs you something real. When you have nothing left and you give it anyway, that's the only kind that counts." He paused. "You gave Rex your last meal. In 9-degree cold with your child in the back seat, you gave a stranger your last hot meal because you decided a human life was worth more than your hunger. You didn't ask who he was first. You didn't ask what you'd get in return." He looked at her steadily. "That is the only kind of loyalty we recognize." Behind him, the vast assembly of riders stood in silence. "As of last night," Garrett said, "you and your daughter are under the protection of the Michigan Charter. That's not a favor. It's not charity. It's a debt, and we pay our debts." Nora opened her mouth and then closed it again. There was nothing adequate available. Rex leaned in from the side. "We've got something to show you," he said. "Can you ride in a truck?" The F-250 was enormous and black and warm. Warm in a way that only a vehicle with a fully functional heating system can be warm aggressively, immediately, almost offensively warm, after what the inside of the Taurus had become. Nora sat in the passenger seat with May on her lap and felt the heat moving through her like something being restored, like circulation returning to a limb that had gone numb. The driver was a woman named Calloway. She offered the single name without elaboration, as though it were both first and last, and that was the end of the discussion. She had a scar along her left cheek that pulled the corner of her mouth into a permanent slight expression of skepticism, and she drove with the focused, economical style of someone who had covered serious distances in serious conditions and didn't feel the need to discuss it. "Where are we going?" Nora asked. "You'll see," Calloway said. Outside, the convoy assembled itself with a precision that suggested long practice. The Harleys took up positions around the truck in a configuration that left no gap, no angle of approach uncovered. Then they moved. They moved south away from the river through the gray December streets of Detroit, past the closed storefronts and the pawn shops and the churches and the long stretches of lots where houses had been and were no longer. The convoy moved at a pace that was neither hurried nor slow, claiming the road the way water claims a channel completely and without apology. May had her face pressed against the passenger window, watching the procession of motorcycles flanking the truck with an expression of pure, uncomplicated wonder. She had stopped asking questions and was simply receiving the spectacle which at 6 years old is still an available option. Nora watched the road ahead and tried to prepare herself for whatever was coming and found that she couldn't because she had no category for it. They turned into a quiet neighborhood 30 minutes south of the river. Working-class blocks, modest houses, mature trees with their bare branches making black patterns against the white sky. Nora had been through neighborhoods like this 1,000 times. She knew what they looked like. She knew their rhythms. She did not know what she was looking at when the truck turned the final corner. The lot occupied a double-wide corner position where two streets intersected. It was large, larger than the single residential lots on either side, and it had clearly once held something, the concrete footings of a previous structure still visible at the edges. But whatever had been there was gone, cleared down to bare earth. And on that bare earth, something was being assembled with a speed and organization that seemed to belong to a different order of reality than the quiet neighborhood around it. The modular home had arrived in sections. 3 flatbed trailers parked along the far side of the lot, their loads already partially offloaded. The prefabricated wall sections, insulated, pre-wired complete, were stacked and staged in a sequence that told you someone had planned this down to the order of operations. The foundation slab had been poured and was already cured, which meant it had been done in the night, which meant the decision had been made in the middle of the night, which meant someone had called a concrete crew at 3 in the morning, and that concrete crew had come. And over all of it, swarming across the slab and along the stage materials, and up onto the rising framework of what was becoming with visible, measurable speed, the skeleton of a house, were bikers. Men and women in leather cuts and denim and work gloves wielding framing hammers and power drills, and levels carrying wall sections in pairs, and locking them into place with the coordinated precision of people who knew exactly what they were doing because they had done it before, or because they were simply built for the application of force and focus to a problem. And this was a problem they had decided to solve. Sparks showered from the driveway where 2 welders were assembling a reinforced gate. An electrician was threading copper wire through exposed studs with the concentrated attention of a man who understood that the details were where the work actually lived. Along the south side of the lot, a line of cement trucks, 4 of them, their drums still turning, were positioned to pour what would become a heated driveway. Calloway parked the truck. Nora sat and looked at it through the windshield. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. Rex appeared at her door. He opened it. "Come on," he said. She got out. The cold hit her again, but different now. Now it smelled of fresh-cut pine and hot asphalt, and the sharp smell of electrical work, and underneath all of that, barely detectable but present, the ghost of something that smelled like possibility. "What is this?" Nora said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "The club owns a lot of real estate in this city," Rex said. He was standing beside her, his good arm at his side, the cast on his left arm bright white against the leather of his cut. "This lot's been sitting empty for 2 years. We were going to use it for storage." He paused. "At 3 this morning, Garrett made some calls." "You're building a house," Nora said. Not a question. The evidence was unambiguous. "We're building your house," Rex said. "Title's already in your name. Warren Hicks filed the paperwork at 6 this morning." Nora looked at him. She looked at the rising frame of the structure, at the dozens of men and women working on it with the focused intensity of people who understood that the cold was a factor and the clock was real. She looked at May, who had come to stand beside her, and was watching a team of 4 bikers hoist a wall section into place with the absorbed attention she usually reserved for things she was trying to memorize. "I don't know what to say," Nora said. "You don't have to say anything," Rex replied. And that was the end of that particular conversation, because a commotion had started at the perimeter of the lot. The sound of an official vehicle, the register of an engine that considers itself authorized. The city inspector's car was white with an orange stripe along the door, and it pulled up to the lot with its lights going and parked at an angle clearly intended to communicate authority. The man who got out was named Leland Pruitt, and he was short and wore a suit under his coat that was not quite warm enough for the weather, and he carried a clipboard with the aggressive purposefulness of a man who has decided that his clipboard is the most powerful object in any given room. He took in the construction site. He took in the dozens of workers. He took in the machinery and the materials and the three flatbed trailers and the concrete trucks and the sparking welders. His face moved through several distinct expressions in rapid succession, settling finally on official indignation. Hey! His voice was high and sharp in the cold air. Shut it down, everybody, stop! The noise of the site began to diminish. Power saws wound down, hammers stilled. The assembled bikers turned in the slow-turning way of large groups who have become aware of something that requires their attention. Pruitt moved toward the center of the lot, clipboard raised. You do not have zoning permits for a residential build of this scale. This is an unauthorized construction in a mixed-use transitional zone, and I am ordering you to cease all work immediately, pending inspection and proper application for... He stopped. He had arrived at approximately the center of the assembled crowd, and the center of the assembled crowd was not the most comfortable place to find yourself when you were one man with a clipboard and the crowd in question numbered in the hundreds and wore matching leather. The silence was absolute. Pruitt swallowed. His Adam's apple moved with visible effort. He looked around at the faces, looking back at him, patient, still entirely unmoved by the clipboard, and something in his posture shifted, a slight retraction, the body preparing for a tactical reconsideration. Garrett Cole emerged from the crowd. He walked toward Pruitt without haste, wiping his hands on a work rag, which he then folded and tucked into his back pocket. He stopped a few feet from the inspector and regarded him with the calm of a man who has never once confused loudness for power. Morning, Garrett said. Sir, this construction is completely authorized, said another voice. A black Mercedes had pulled up behind the inspector's car, and the man stepping out of it was Warren Hicks, the club's retained attorney, who had the quality of looking expensive without looking ostentatious. He carried a leather briefcase that he opened as he walked, extracting a document packet secured with a large binder clip. He handed it to Pruitt. Emergency expedited permits. Warren said, approved by the mayor's office at 5:30 this morning. Zoning variance for residential construction on a transitional lot approved. Environmental site clearance completed and filed. Safety inspection waiver for modular construction with licensed contractors signed. He paused, letting Pruitt work through the pages. Everything you're looking at is legal, filed, and time-stamped. If you'd like to verify any of it, the mayor's office opens at 9. It's currently 7:42. You're welcome to wait. Pruitt flipped through the papers. His jaw worked. He looked at the permits. He looked at Warren Hicks. He looked at Garrett Cole, who watched him with the patient attention of a man who has all day and knows it. Then Pruitt looked up at the several hundred bikers watching the exchange in collective silence. The engine started. Not all at once. Not a roar. Nothing aggressive. Just a gradual rolling ignition that moved through the assembled motorcycles like a wave moving through water. The sound building from individual growls into a unified, low resonant thunder that occupied the chest cavity and did not leave quickly. Pruitt looked at the permits one more time. He looked at Garrett. He looked at Warren Hicks. Then he walked back to his car with the briskness of a man who has made a decision he intends to execute before he can reconsider it. He got in. He started the engine. He pulled away. The crowd erupted, not in a war cry, but a collective release of held breath that expressed itself as laughter and cheering, and the sound of work resuming, saws cycling back up, and hammers finding their rhythm, and the whole organized momentum of the construction returning to speed, like an engine recovering from a brief interruption. Nora stood at the edge of the lot and watched Pruitt's car disappear around the corner. She should have felt only relief. She did feel relief. But under it was something else, a lower frequency awareness that the look on Pruitt's face as he'd walked away had not been the look of a man who had accepted defeat. It had been the look of a man adjusting his approach. There was a difference. She filed it away. There was too much else happening to do anything with it right now. The morning moved. The house rose. It was genuinely extraordinary to watch the kind of thing that reframed what you thought was possible in a single day's work, when the people doing the work had decided that the normal timeline was a suggestion rather than a rule. By mid-morning, the exterior wall sections were locked and plumbed, and the roof trusses were going up. By noon, the roof deck was sheeted, and the first passes of roofing material were being laid. A team of 4 electricians had the panel roughed in and were running circuits with a speed that suggested they had done exactly this, probably faster under worse conditions. Nora spent the morning being moved from place to place by people who seemed to understand that she needed to be near the work but not responsible for it. May spent it attached to Cutter Briggs, who had apparently decided that the little girl was his responsibility for the duration, and who carried her on his shoulders for part of the afternoon and taught her in a serious and comprehensive way the names of various hand tools. Rex appeared periodically. He didn't explain the logistics, didn't narrate what was happening. He checked on Nora, established that she was standing, confirmed that May was warm, and then returned to the work. This was Nora was beginning to understand his mode of care, not talk but presence, not description but action. It was around 2 in the afternoon while Nora sat on a camp chair that someone had produced from somewhere and watched the siding going up on the south wall that Ridley Nash made himself known. She heard him before she saw him clearly. A voice young and controlled, caring enough to be heard by more than its intended recipient. "This isn't what we do," the voice said. She turned. Ridley Nash was 26 years old and had the kind of lean, angular face that in another context might have been described as handsome, and in this one simply read as young. He was standing in a loose cluster of men near the equipment staging area, and while he was speaking to the group, there was a directional quality to what he was saying. It was aimed specifically at Rex, who stood at the edge of the group with his good arm across his chest and his expression entirely neutral. "We run a charter," Ridley said. "We're not a charity organization. We're not a housing authority. What we're doing here, this isn't protocol. This isn't what the charter exists for." He wasn't shouting. That was what made it land differently than a shout would have. He was making an argument in a measured, reasonable tone, the tone of a man who believed he was on the right side of the logic. "Rex goes down," Ridley continued, "and I'm glad he's alive. I am, but since when does a personal situation become a charter operation? Since when do we commit 500 brothers to a build because of something that happened to one man on a road?" He paused. If this woman needed help, there were other ways. Quiet ways. We didn't need to make this a production. The group around him was still, not agreeing, not disagreeing, listening in the careful way people listen when they understand that what's being said is significant and that the response will matter. Rex said nothing. He looked at Ridley Nash the way a landscape looks at weather, without urgency, without alarm, simply present and prepared for whatever the weather decided to do. "Say what you've got to say," Rex told him. Ridley met his gaze. "I'm saying we've got a protocol for a reason. I'm saying one person's gratitude debt doesn't justify a charter-wide commitment. And I'm saying," he stopped, recalibrated. "Then I'm saying, where's the line? We do this for her, who's next? How many people in this city need a house?" Rex was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the flatness of controlled emotion, the voice of a man who is keeping something level because allowing it to rise would change the nature of the conversation. "Where were you last night?" Rex said. Ridley blinked. "What? Where were you?" Rex repeated. "At 11:40 last night when I was lying in the snow on the I-94 access road with a broken collarbone and my core temperature dropping. Where were you when I was shaking so hard I couldn't close my hand? Where were you when my lungs were locking up and I was making my peace with the situation because I was absolutely certain that the cold had me?" Ridley said nothing. "Nowhere near there," Rex said. "Because you didn't know. Because it was dark and cold and nobody knew." He let that sit for a moment. She knew. She was right there. She had nothing, and I mean nothing. Ridley a dead sterno can and 3 blankets and $11, and she dragged me out of the snow and she fed me the last hot food she had on earth because she could not let a man die in front of her daughter. He looked around the group. His gaze moved slowly, landing on each face for a moment before moving to the next. "That's not a stranger," Rex said. "That's family. The question of what we owe her was settled the moment she made that choice, and it was settled in full, and there's no protocol that covers what happened last night because the protocol was written by people who hadn't met her yet. Silence. Ridley Nash looked at the ground. His jaw worked. The controlled certainty he'd entered the conversation with had not vanished exactly, but it had shifted, developed a crack along a fault line he hadn't known was there. He didn't respond. He didn't agree, at least not in words. He turned and walked away from the group toward the south side of the lot where the siding work was ongoing, and picked up a hammer from the staging area and went to work. Garrett, who had been standing at the edge of the conversation without participating in it, looked at Rex. Rex looked at the house going up. "He's not wrong about the protocol," Rex said quietly. "No," Garrett agreed. "He's just wrong about what matters more." The afternoon moved into early evening. The light faded from gray to a deep dark blue that was almost purple at the horizon, and the temperature, which had come up fractionally during the day, began its return to the severe cold of the previous night. Work lights came on around the lot, powered by a generator positioned precisely for this purpose, and in their hard white light, the house continued to take shape, siding going up, windows being set, the interior taking on the closed, definite character of a structure that was becoming a space. And then Pruitt came back, not alone this time. He arrived at 4:50 in the afternoon with a second car, a city vehicle, bland and official. He parked at the curb and got out, and this time he didn't come onto the lot. He stood at the edge of the sidewalk with his clipboard and spoke to the driver of the second car, who was a woman in her 40s in a wool coat with a badge on a lanyard around her neck. The woman walked toward the lot. She asked for Nora by name. Nora came forward from the camp chair where she'd been sitting with May asleep against her side. Her stomach had already tightened. She recognized the badge, the lanyard, the professional neutrality on the woman's face, the face of someone who was here to perform an official function and had separated herself from her feelings about it. "Ms. Callahan," the woman said, "my name is Patricia Dunmore. I'm with the Department of Child and Family Services." She said it quietly with neither warmth nor coldness. "We've received a report expressing concern about your daughter's living situation and your capacity to provide a stable environment. I've been asked to conduct a preliminary assessment." Nora looked at her. Then she looked past her at Leland Pruitt, standing at the curb with his clipboard watching. "I see," Nora said. Her voice was very calm. The calmness of a person who has reached the bottom of something and discovered that the bottom is solid and they are still standing on it. Patricia Dunmore followed her gaze, looked at Pruitt, looked back at Nora. Something moved through her professional neutrality, not disapproval exactly, but an acknowledgement, a subtle adjustment. "I'm required to inform you," Patricia said, lowering her voice slightly, "that depending on the outcome of the assessment, there is a possibility of a temporary placement order for your daughter while your housing and financial situation is reviewed." May, disturbed by the change in her mother's posture, even in sleep, stirred against Nora's side and opened her eyes. Nora put her hand on her daughter's head, felt the warmth of her, the solid reality of her. "Okay," Nora said. Patricia Dunmore opened her notebook. Rex appeared at Nora's shoulder. Then Garrett. Then Warren Hicks, who had materialized with his briefcase as he seemed always to do at the moment when a briefcase was most relevant. "Ms. Callahan has legal representation," Warren said to Patricia pleasantly, "and we'd be happy to make documentation available regarding the housing situation, which, as you can see," he gestured at the structure rising behind them, its windows now all set, its exterior largely closed in, "is being actively resolved." Patricia looked at the house. She wrote something in her notebook. She looked at May, who was awake now and watching her with the serious assessment of a 6-year-old who understands that something important is happening. "I'll need to schedule a formal interview," Patricia said, "and a home visit once the property is habitable." "Absolutely," Warren said. "We'll have the certificate of occupancy to you within 48 hours. Patricia looked at Nora one more time. Her professional neutrality had not broken, but there was something in her eyes, something human underneath the procedure that was doing its own form of assessment. She closed her notebook. She walked back to her car. At the curb, she said something brief to Pruitt that Nora couldn't hear. Whatever it was, Pruitt's expression from this distance did not improve. The two cars pulled away. The work lights hummed, the generator ran. Around the lot, the assembled bikers returned to what they'd been doing without comment, without drama, and the sound of hammers and drills resumed its rhythm against the night. Nora stood at the edge of the lot and watched the taillights until they were gone. Behind her, she heard May say to no one in particular, "Is that lady going to take me away?" It was Cutter Briggs who answered. He came and crouched down to May's level, which for a man of his dimensions was a significant architectural undertaking, and he looked at her with complete seriousness. "No," he said, "she is not." May looked at him, considered this. Then she looked at her mother. Nora crossed the distance between them and crouched down beside May and put both hands on her daughter's face and looked at her directly. "Nobody is taking you anywhere," Nora said. "I promise." May held her mother's gaze. Whatever she saw there, whatever quality of certainty lives in a mother's face, when the certainty is absolute, satisfied her. She nodded once with the gravity of someone who has received important information and filed it correctly. "Okay," May said, and Nora still crouched in the cold outside the rising frame of what would tomorrow be a house, understood something she hadn't fully understood before that moment. That the DCFS worker would come back. That Patricia Dunmore would need to be sat across from and looked in the eye and given every piece of paper and every true fact and every clear account of every decision that had led to this point. That Leland Pruitt would try again because the look on his face at the curb told her he would, and that she would need to be the one to face him, not Garrett, not Warren Hicks, not Rex. Her, because May was hers, and what was hers she would protect. Not with a tire iron in the dark this time, but with something harder than a tire iron and more durable than cold. With the truth. She stood up. She put her hand on May's shoulder. Inside the structure behind them, somebody ran a drill through a final connection, and the interior lights came on for the first time, warm yellow and entirely real. And the glow of them spilled out through the new windows and fell across the concrete and the snow in rectangles of light that were in the dark of that December evening, the most beautiful thing Nora Callahan had seen in a very long time. The night passed differently than the one before it. Not comfortably, they were still in the Taurus, which Calloway had driven back to the overpass after the work lights came on, and the interior of the house was confirmed sealed and heated because the certificate of occupancy hadn't been issued yet, and Warren Hicks was precise about these things. But differently. 50 motorcycles idled in a loose perimeter around the parking area under the overpass, and the men on them were awake. And the fact of their wakefulness changed the quality of the dark in a way that Nora felt in her body before she understood it in her mind. She slept. Not deeply and not without waking twice, but she slept, which was more than she had managed in 3 days. May slept without interruption for the first time in 3 weeks, which told Nora something about the nature of a 6-year-old's fear, that it was more honest than an adult's, less managed, more directly responsive to what the body actually sensed. What May's body sensed, surrounded by those engines and that wakefulness, was safety, and so she slept. When Nora woke at 6 in the morning, the sky was the particular dark blue that precedes winter dawn by about 40 minutes, and there was a paper bag on the hood of the Taurus that hadn't been there when she fell asleep. Inside it were 2 breakfast sandwiches still warm in their foil, a small carton of orange juice, and a coffee in a paper cup with a plastic lid that read in marker 2 sugars, which was in fact exactly how Nora took her coffee, and she had not told anyone that. She didn't ask how they knew. Some things in the world she had stumbled into seemed to move through channels she couldn't see. She held the cup in both hands and let the warmth move through her palms and thought that this small specific knowledge of how she took her coffee was in its way more startling than the 500 motorcycles had been. The motorcycles were power. This was attention, and attention, she was learning, was its own language in this world. By 7:30, Warren Hicks called her on the phone that one of the female riders had pressed into her hand the previous afternoon. He told her the certificate of occupancy had been processed and that the house was legally habitable as of 6:45 that morning. He told her the title was recorded in her name. He told her the utility accounts, gas, electric, water, had been established and were current. He read her the address of the house as though she might want to write it down. She wrote it down, her own address. For the first time in 3.5 months, she had an address. She sat with that for a moment before she did anything else. She looked at the number she had written, the street name and the house number, in her own handwriting on the back of a receipt from a gas station. And she thought about what an address means, not just practically, not just as a line on a form, but as a declaration, as proof of occupation, as the answer to the question of where you are in the world. Then she looked at the DCFS card that Patricia Dunmore had left with her, and she made a decision, and she acted on it before she could talk herself into waiting. She called the number on the card. Patricia Dunmore answered on the third ring, which told Nora she was already at her desk, which meant she was the kind of person who came in early, which told Nora something about what kind of conversation this would be. "Ms. Callahan," Patricia said, not surprised, not unwelcoming. "I'd like to come in today," Nora said, "for the interview. I know you said you'd schedule it, but I'd like to come in this morning if you have time. I want to bring documentation." A pause, brief but present. "I have time at 10, Patricia said. "I'll be there at 10. She ended the call and looked at May, who was eating the second half of her breakfast sandwich with the focused attention of someone reacquainting themselves with the concept of enough food. "We're going to go talk to a lady this morning," Nora told her. "The same lady from yesterday. You remember her?" May nodded. "The one with the badge." "That's right. I need you to be yourself, okay? Just completely yourself. Don't try to seem fine if you're not fine, and don't try to seem scared if you're not scared. Just be who you are." May considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Can I bring Mr. Pemberton?" Mr. Pemberton was a stuffed rabbit of indeterminate age and color who had been in May's possession since she was 18 months old, and whose left ear had been reattached twice with upholstery thread. "Yes," Nora said. "Absolutely bring Mr. Pemberton." She called Rex next. She didn't plan to her hand made the decision while her mind was still composing a different plan, and when he answered after one ring with a single syllable that communicated both readiness and the absence of alarm, she found she knew exactly what she wanted to say. "I'm going to the DCFS office at 10, she told him. "I don't need anyone to come with me. I need to do this myself, but I wanted you to know." Silence for a moment. She could hear him breathing steady and considered. "Okay," Rex said. "I may need Warren there afterward if it goes badly, but I'm going in first." "Warren will be available," Rex said. "However it goes." "Thank you." "Nora." "What?" Another pause longer than the first. "Take everything," he said. "Every piece of paper you have about Danny, about the hospital, about the house, about every decision you made. Don't leave anything out because you think it makes you look bad. Take all of it." She had already been thinking this, but hearing it from him settled something in the thinking, gave it the weight of confirmation. "I will," she said. The DCFS office was a government building in the way that all government buildings in mid-sized Midwestern cities are government buildings, functional, fluorescent, designed to process large numbers of people with a minimum of sentiment. The waiting room had plastic chairs in a color that had once been blue, and the kind of industrial carpet chosen for its ability to hide what happens to it rather than for any aesthetic quality. Nora sat in one of the plastic chairs with May on her left and a manila folder on her lap, and Mr. Pemberton tucked under May's arm, and she waited. She had the folder. She had assembled it in the back seat of the Taurus in the 40 minutes between her call to Warren and Calloway arriving to drive her, pulling from the envelope she kept beneath the driver's seat. The envelope that contained the documents she had never stopped carrying, because some part of her understood that these papers were the proof that her life had been real, that Danny had been real, that the house and the garden and the Saturday mornings had all actually happened and not simply been a thing she dreamed. She had the death certificate. She had Danny's medical records, the summary pages, the itemized bills from the Ann Arbor clinic, with the amounts circled in pen from when she'd first tried to understand how much they owed and given up because the number was too large to hold. She had the foreclosure notice with its stamps in its procedural language. She had a letter from the school district confirming that May was enrolled and had a record of attendance that was given the circumstances. Remarkable. She had a letter she had written herself by hand on a piece of notebook paper the night before, 2 pages describing in plain language the sequence of events from Danny's diagnosis to the morning of this interview, with dates where she knew them and approximations where she didn't, and no editorializing, just the facts arranged in order. She had read it back to herself in the car, and it had sounded, she thought, like what it was: the record of a person who had tried everything available to her and lost to circumstances that were not the result of negligence or indifference or failure of character, but simply of a cancer that arrived without asking, in a financial system that had no mechanism for surviving it intact. Patricia Dunmore came to get her at 10:05. She led them down a hallway to a small office with a desk and 2 chairs and a window that looked out onto a parking lot. She offered May a box of crayons and a pad of paper, which May accepted with appropriate gravity, and she poured 2 small cups of water from a pitcher on the credenza and set one in front of Nora. Then she sat down across the desk. She had the file. Nora could see her name on the tab. She could see Pruitt's name on a document near the top of the file, not the document itself, just the letterhead. And she filed this information away without expression. "Ms. Callahan," Patricia said, "I want to be direct with you about how this process works. A report was filed expressing concern about your daughter's welfare and the stability of your housing situation. My job is to assess whether those concerns are substantiated. I'm not here to prosecute anything. I'm here to establish what's true." "I understand," Nora said. "I'll ask you some questions, and I'd like you to answer as completely and honestly as you can." "Okay. Yes." Patricia opened her notebook. She asked her questions. She asked them in a clear, measured sequence that moved from Danny's death forward through each major event, and Nora answered each one directly, completely, and in order. She didn't qualify. She didn't editorialize. When the answer reflected a bad decision or a failure, she said so and explained the context and moved on. When she didn't know something precisely, she said so and gave her best estimate and noted that it was an estimate. At a certain point, Patricia asked about the morning under the overpass and about Rex and about the motorcycle club, and Nora told her that too. All of it. The soup, the patch, the van driving away, the 500 motorcycles at dawn. She told it straight, without apology, without the defensive framing that the situation might have tempted her toward, because the truth of what had happened didn't require any frame other than itself. Patricia wrote as she spoke. She had a shorthand that moved across the notebook page in small, efficient marks. When Nora finished, Patricia looked up. "Ms. Callahan," she said, "I'm going to say something that is outside my official role and that I want you to understand is my own observation, not a formal finding." Nora waited. "The report filed with our office," Patricia said carefully, "describes a pattern of instability and neglect. What you've described to me and what I can verify from these documents describes something different. It describes a woman who has navigated an extraordinary level of loss and hardship without at any point placing her own interests ahead of her daughter's welfare. That's not instability. That's the opposite of instability." Nora said nothing. She was gripping the edge of the folder in her lap, and she made a conscious effort to release it. Patricia looked at May, who had been drawing with the crayons, and who looked up at the pause in the conversation with the alert attention of a child who has learned to read the temperature of adult exchanges. "Hi, May," Patricia said. "Hi," said May. "What are you drawing?" May looked at her paper. "Our new house," she said. "It's not done yet. I'm doing the driveway." Patricia looked at the drawing. Then she looked at Nora. "I'll need to conduct the home visit," Patricia said. "That's required, but based on this interview, I don't see grounds for a placement order." She paused. "I'll notify my supervisor of my preliminary finding this afternoon." Something released in Nora's chest. Not dramatically, not the sudden outpouring, the visible physical relief. More quietly than that. More like a knot that has been pulled steadily tighter over a long period of time that someone has finally simply stopped pulling. Thank you, Nora said. The home visit will happen within the next 48 hours, Patricia said. Once we've completed that and I've submitted my full report, the file will be closed, assuming nothing changes. Nothing will change, Nora said. Patricia looked at her. The professional neutrality had not gone away, but there was something beside it now, coexisting with it, something that looked in the gray light of a government office on a December morning like respect. I believe you, Patricia said. She walked them back to the waiting room. At the door, May turned and offered Patricia Dunmore a drawing, not the house she'd been working on, but a smaller, quicker sketch. She must have done on a second page. Two figures, one large and one small, holding hands with a rectangle behind them that was recognizably a house, and above it, a sun with rays coming off it in every direction. Rendered in yellow crayon with the absolute confidence of a child who has decided that the sun belongs in the picture regardless of the weather. Patricia took it. She held it with both hands and looked at it for a moment. Thank you, May, she said. You're welcome, said May. Outside on the sidewalk in the cold, Nora stood with her folder and her daughter, and the exhaustion that follows, sustained effort, and the lightness that follows, a long time of being afraid. She called Rex. It's okay, she said when he picked up. A pause. Good, he said. She'll do the home visit within 48 hours. She said she'll close the file after. Warren will have everything ready for her when she comes. Rex. Yeah. Pruitt's name was on a document in her file, his letterhead. A silence longer than the previous ones. I see, Rex said. His voice had gone very flat and very still. I'm not asking you to do anything about it, Nora said. I just wanted you to know. Understood, Rex said. She ended the call and looked down at May, who was examining a crack in the sidewalk with the focused attention of someone studying a map. Ready to go see the house? Nora asked. May looked up. Her face went through several expressions in quick succession, settling on one that Nora recognized as the face of someone trying to contain a feeling too large for their current capacity. Is it really ours? May asked. It's really ours. May thought about this. Then she reached up and took her mother's hand, and they walked to where Calloway was waiting with the truck. The house seen in daylight for the first time from the outside was larger than Nora had registered in the chaos and emotion of the previous day. 3 bedrooms, a full kitchen, a living room with a large window facing south, a covered porch running along the front. The siding was completed a deep gray with white trim, and the driveway had been finished and sealed, and was already cleared of the snow that had fallen overnight. The reinforced gate at the side was closed but not locked. Inside was a different order of revelation. The bikers had not simply built a shell. They had, in the hours Nora had been away, finished it completely. The walls were drywalled and painted off-white throughout, clean with warm wood trim at the floors and windows that smelled of fresh finish. The kitchen had appliances, all of them new, all of them installed and connected. A refrigerator, a gas range, a dishwasher, a microwave bolted to the cabinet above the range. The kitchen table was maple heavy and solid with 4 chairs, and on it someone had placed a white ceramic bowl containing 6 oranges, because the impulse to fill a new kitchen with something living is apparently universal. May's room was at the end of the hall. Nora opened the door and stood in the doorway and looked at it. There was a bed with a white frame and a mattress and bedding. Real bedding with a printed pattern of small yellow stars on a navy background. There was a dresser. There was a small bookshelf with a dozen children's books arranged on it, spines out, which told Nora that someone had thought specifically about what a 6-year-old might want to find in her room and had acted on that thought. On the windowsill was a small lamp with a yellow shade that cast a warm pool of light across the floor. May walked past her mother and into the room slowly. She stood in the center of it, turning once in a full circle, taking in the walls and the window and the lamp and the books. Then she walked to the bed and sat down on the edge of it, testing the mattress with both hands, and then she lay back and looked up at the ceiling. It has a ceiling, May said. It does, Nora said. In the car, the roof was really close. I know. May was quiet for a moment. Then I like having a ceiling. Nora leaned against the doorframe and looked at her daughter lying on the yellow-starred bedding in her own room in their own house, and allowed herself fully and without management to feel it. Not just relief, not just gratitude. Something larger than either of those things. Something that didn't have a clean name, but that lived in the chest and expanded when you stopped trying to contain it. The afternoon gathering was quiet by the standards of what the previous 2 days had contained. Perhaps 40 bikers, the core of the charter, gathered in the new living room and on the porch, and the atmosphere was different from the controlled urgency of the construction. Looser, warmer, the ease of people who have done what they set out to do and are now allowing themselves to exist in the aftermath of it. Someone had brought a pot of chili, and someone else had brought cornbread, and there was beer and soda and coffee, and the new kitchen was warm with the heat of it all. And May ate 2 bowls of chili with the unfussy appetite of a child who has decided to trust the world again on a provisional basis. Ridley Nash arrived late. He came in through the side door, the one off the covered porch, and he didn't announce himself. He had a wrapped bundle under his arm that he set on the kitchen counter without comment, and he poured himself a coffee, and he stood at the edge of the room in the way of a man who is where he needs to be, but hasn't yet worked out how to be there comfortably. Nora came to the counter for her own coffee and stood beside him. They didn't speak immediately. The room was full of other conversations, other noise, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It had the texture of something that has found its level. "You went to that office yourself," Ridley said eventually. Not a question. "Yes." He nodded. He looked at the chili pot. He looked at May, who was on the floor of the living room, showing Mr. Pemberton to Cutter Briggs, who was examining the rabbit with appropriate seriousness. "That took something," Ridley said. Nora picked up her coffee. "It needed to be done," she said, "and it needed to be me." Ridley turned his cup in his hands. His angular face had a different quality than it had the day before. Still young, still certain in the bone structure, but with something worked loose in it, some assumption that had been present and was now absent. "I said things yesterday," he started. "You said what you believed," Nora said. "That's not nothing." He looked at her. She met his look directly. "You were asking real questions," she said. "Where does it end? What's the line? Those are real questions. I don't think you were wrong to ask them." Ridley was quiet for a moment. Then, "I was wrong about the answer." "Yes," Nora agreed. "You were." He almost smiled. It was the near smile of a man who has been delivered a truth by someone under no obligation to deliver it gently, and who appreciates the directness more than he would have appreciated the softening. He reached into the wrapped bundle he'd set on the counter and held something out to her. It was a small piece of wood, rough cut and unsanded, with the address of the house carved into it in deep, clean letters. Handmade. The carving was precise the work of someone who knew what they were doing with a knife and had taken their time with it. "For the front door," Ridley said. Nora took it. She ran her thumb over the carved numerals, the address of her house. "Thank you, Ridley," she said. He nodded once and picked up his coffee and walked toward the living room, where someone had apparently told a joke that the room was still recovering from. Rex found her on the porch 20 minutes later. He came out alone, closing the side door behind him, and stood at the porch rail looking at the street. It was snowing lightly, the small, fine snow of deep winter, the kind that falls without wind and settles without urgency, covering the driveway and the street, and the neighboring rooftops in a thin, even layer of white. The gate was visible from the porch, solid and closed. Through the windows of the house, the warm light of the interior moved and shifted with the movement of the people inside. Nora stood at the far end of the rail and held her coffee with both hands. Rex set something on the rail between them. It was a piece of wood polished and dark, about the size of a book. Mounted to the center of it was the tin pot. Her tin pot, the dented, battered vessel that had made 4 camping trips and heated emergency oatmeal and held the last meal she had in the world. It had been cleaned and polished, and the work done on it was careful work. The work of someone who understood that the object's value was not in spite of its damage, but because of it, and who had therefore preserved the dents and the discoloration and simply removed the grime. Below the pot set flush into the wood was a small brass plaque. Nora picked the piece up from the rail and held it in both hands. She read the plaque. Blood makes you related. Loyalty makes you family. She stood with it in the cold for a long moment. The snow fell on her shoulders, on her hair, on the polished wood in her hands. Then she turned it over. She wasn't sure why she turned it over. Something in her, the same instinct that had carried her across an overpass parking lot with a tire iron, the same instinct that had made her call Patricia Dunmore at 7:30 in the morning, the same instinct that had driven her to the DCFS office with her folder and her daughter, and her refusal to be ashamed of a single page of it, that instinct told her to look at the back. Taped to the reverse side of the wooden plaque, flat against the wood, was a white envelope. She looked at Rex. He was looking at the street. His profile against the dark and the falling snow was still the cast on his arm, bright white in the low porch light, his breath rising in slow, even clouds that dissolved almost immediately in the cold air. She opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded document, official-looking, with a notarial seal at the bottom. She unfolded it. She read it. She read it again because the first reading didn't fully process the way a number too large to be quickly comprehended requires a second pass before the mind accepts it as real. It was the establishment document for an educational trust. The beneficiary was listed as May Rose Callahan. The amount was sufficient, she understood, as she read, to cover 4 years of college tuition at any institution in the state of Michigan, with a provision for cost of living adjustments through the year of anticipated enrollment. It had been executed by Warren Hicks's trustee. It was dated 2 days prior. The night of the soup. He had done this the night of the soup. Nora lowered the document. She looked at Rex. He was still looking at the street. He had not turned to watch her read it. He had not arranged his face into an expression that anticipated a reaction. He was simply standing at the rail in the cold, watching the snow come down on the quiet residential street, as though he had put the thing on the rail, and whatever happened next was not a performance he needed to witness. She thought about what this meant, not just the money, not just the practical fact of a trust document with her daughter's name on it, but the timing of it. That in the hours after she had fed him soup in the snow, after the van had taken him away, and she had sat in the freezing car with the empty pot and thought she had done something foolish, Rex Malone had been on the phone with Warren Hicks executing a legal document. That he had understood in those hours something about Nora Callahan that she had not yet fully understood about herself. That he had looked at what she did and known, not guessed, not hoped, but known what kind of mother she was and what her daughter would need. The snow had been falling for 20 minutes, and neither of them had moved to go inside. This was something Nora noticed without commenting on, that standing in the cold no longer felt like punishment. After 3 weeks in the Taurus cold was simply what the outside was. Warmth was what you went inside to find. The fact that inside now existed, that it was 20 feet behind her, and it belonged to her, and May would sleep there tonight and every night after, had not yet settled into the place in her mind where permanent things live. It was still in the place where improbable things wait, while the mind decides what to do with them. She thought about Warren Hicks executing a trust document on the night a stranger fed his vice president chicken noodle soup from a tin pot under a highway overpass, because Rex Malone had called him and told him to, because Rex Malone had understood in that moment, lying in the snow, with a broken collarbone, watching a 6-year-old stare at an empty pot, what kind of person Nora Callahan was and what she was owed. She thought Danny would have laughed about this. Not dismissively, he wasn't a dismissive man, but with the laughter that comes from recognizing that life is, when you pay close enough attention, genuinely strange, and that the strangeness is sometimes the point. She thought, I am going to be okay. Not fine, not the way things were before, but okay. The way things can be okay after they have been irrevocably changed, which is a different kind of okay than the one she'd had before, smaller in some ways and larger in others, earned in a way the previous one never had to be. Rex, she said. He turned. His eyes in the porch light were steady. No calculation in them, no preparation for a particular kind of gratitude. Just the same clear, direct attention he had given her that first morning when she looked at him through the car window and recognized that this was a man who said what he meant and meant what he said, and that what he said was usually less than what he meant. Danny raised her with love, Nora said. She was quoting him the words he'd said that morning through the window of the Taurus, the words she'd carried through the DCFS office and through the Chili and through Ridley Nash and through all of it. You said that. Danny raised her with love and will raise her with a future, Rex said. Yeah, he paused. That's what I said. You did this the night it happened, Nora said. Before any of this. Before the house, before the charter meeting, before all of it. The decision was made the night it happened, Rex said. The rest was logistics. Nora looked at the document in her hands. Then she looked at the tin pot in its polished frame. Then she looked at the man standing at her porch rail with a broken collarbone and a coffee he hadn't touched in the snow at the end of what had been the longest 3 days of her life. She didn't have words for it. She had been a person who had words, who had studied language, who had taught small children to read, who had written condolence letters and thank you notes, and 2 pages of plain honest truth on a piece of notebook paper the night before last. But for this, she did not have words, and so she didn't try to produce them. She set the frame pot and the document on the porch rail. She crossed the distance between them and put her arms around Rex Malone, who was large enough that she didn't reach all the way around, and who stood very still for a moment, as though recalibrating to the unexpected input, and then put his one good arm around her and held on. They stood that way for a while. The snow came down. The light from inside the house fell warm and yellow through the windows onto the porch boards. Through the glass, the sounds of people talking and laughing moved in and out of audibility, the living sound of a group of people who have accomplished something together and are now simply existing together in its aftermath. After a while, the door opened and May appeared, because May had developed over the course of her short life a precise sense for when her mother needed to be found. She looked at the 2 adults standing at the rail. She looked at the framed tin pot. She went to it and picked it up and looked at it, really looked at it, turning it carefully in her small hands, examining the dents and the discoloration in the plaque with the letters she couldn't all read yet. That's our pot, she said. It is, Nora said. May looked up. How come it's in a frame? Rex crouched down to her level, slowly accommodating the cast. He looked at her with the seriousness the question deserved. Because some things, he said, are worth remembering exactly as they were. May considered this. She looked at the pot again. She ran her finger across the engraved letters of the plaque the same way her mother had, feeling the shapes. It's kind of beat up, May observed. Yes, it is, Rex said. But you put it in a nice frame anyway. That's right. May thought about this for a long moment with the full attention of a person for whom conclusions matter and who does not rush them. I think that's good, she said finally. I think that's the right thing. Rex looked at the little girl. Something moved through his face, something that was not the rare, brief smile of the previous morning, but something quieter than that and deeper and more permanent. The expression of a man who has been in the presence of something that has no name and has decided to let it exist without naming it. Yeah, he said. I think so too. Later, when the gathering had wound down and the last of the trucks and bikes had pulled away and the gate was closed and the porch light was on, Nora put May to bed in the room with the yellow-starred bedding and the small lamp and the dozen books. She tucked the covers around her and sat on the edge of the mattress and listened to the sound of the house, the hum of the furnace, the small creaks of new wood settling in the cold, the absolute silence of a space that belonged to them. May held Mr. Pemberton against her chest and looked up at the ceiling with the expression of a person taking inventory of something they want to be sure is real. Mommy, she said. Yeah, Bug. Is the car going to be okay out there, without us in it? Nora thought about the Taurus, which was sitting in an auto shop 2 miles away, where one of the club's mechanics had towed it that afternoon, and was already, according to what someone had told her, in the process of being determined salvageable or not. She thought about the three thin blankets and the dead sterno can and the wire hanger cradle that had held the tin pot over the flame. The car is going to be fine, she said, and so are we. May accepted this. She closed her eyes. Within minutes, her breathing slowed and deepened into the complete, uncomplicated sleep of a child who has decided that tonight the world is safe. Nora sat with her for a while longer, listening to her breathe. Then she went to the living room and sat on the couch, a real couch, solid and deep, and looked out the large south-facing window at the street outside. The snow had continued falling, fine and steady, and it had covered everything evenly. The driveway, the sidewalk, the rooftops of the houses across the street, the motorcycles parked at intervals along the block where the night watch had positioned themselves without being asked. The way they did everything without announcement, without explanation, simply because they had decided it was what the situation required. The orange glow of the streetlights caught the falling snow and made it luminous. The street was quiet. The house was warm. Nora thought about Danny. She did this the way she always did it, not as an act of grief, exactly not anymore, but as an act of continuation of keeping him present in the space of her attention, because presence, even of the dead, is a form of company that the living need and are allowed to take. She thought about the 4 jokes he told in rotation and the way he'd never stop telling them. She thought about the tomatoes in the raised beds and the way he would come home from a job site and go directly to the garden before coming inside, pulling a tomato off the vine and eating it standing there in his work clothes, as though the first order of business after a day of making things was to eat something that had grown without being built. She thought you would have liked Rex. She thought you would have liked all of them. She thought May is going to be okay. She is going to be completely, entirely, irreversibly okay. She thought about the tin pot in its frame on the porch rail, and the envelope beneath it, and the document inside the envelope with her daughter's name on it. She thought about the fact that a stranger had read her character correctly in the dark and the cold, in the worst hours she had known, and had responded to what he read with a precision and a permanence that she was still absorbing. She thought about what it means to be seen, not pitied, not rescued, not handled, seen, understood, recognized as the person you actually are, rather than the person your circumstances might suggest. She thought that this was perhaps the rarest thing one person could offer another, and that Rex Malone, who would never in 1,000 years have described himself in these terms, had offered it to her without ceremony on a frozen access road at midnight, and that everything that had followed was simply the expression of that recognition, made concrete, made wood and wire and copper pipe and warm water and a bowl of 6 oranges on a maple table. Outside, one of the bikers on night watch shifted on his bike, and the small movement sent a brief flash of chrome through the falling snow and then was still again. The furnace ran. The house held its heat. The snow came down on Detroit on the overpass and the access road and the snowbank where Rex Malone had lain 3 nights ago, dying into the ice and covered everything, with the same patient, indifferent white, the way winter does, the way time does, laying a clean surface over what came before, not to erase it, but to preserve it beneath. The way you preserve something dented and scarred and entirely worth keeping by putting it in a frame and hanging it where everyone can see. Nora Callahan sat in the warm living room of her house and listened to the snowfall and watched the men on their bikes in the street below and breathed steadily and completely for the first time in 14 months.